Ahead of the drop pods, a brief but widespread bombardment of shells detonated over the outworks with soft, flowery bangs. As they did not hit the ground, they seemed no threat at all. But then the defenders saw a paint burst spread, begin its rapid sinking, and they understood the danger that these bombs posed. "Gas! Gas! Gas!" Whistles blew. Men shouted. Though millennia old, gas was still a much-feared weapon. An attack by the very air induced an atavistic response deep in the limbic system, a fear of drowning, of suffocation, a fear common to all creatures that must breathe. Runnican swore in fluent underhive gutter slang. 1,000 hands went for cases at belts. The Space Marines, salted among the lines, remained impassive, protected from all environmental harms by their power armor. Katsuhiro was nervous of the Space Marines, for all the awe he felt. He had never wanted to be one, but at that moment he envied them their protection and their lack of fear. Though the conscripts had started out poorly equipped, the rate of attrition was so high that by that time most of the troops on the outworks had some form of protection against the poison, a gas mask at least, looted from the dead, if not assigned to them personally. Katsuhiro fell into the former category. He had no training in how to use the mask he'd acquired, and nearly didn't manage to get it on. In his panic, he yanked on the straps all wrong and got the mask twisted about. A brown fog sifted around him as he struggled. He smelled acrid chemicals. Then, mercifully, he managed to pull the mask down to cover his face. Stinging eyes made him fear the worst, but they stopped streaming after a moment, and his breathing steadied. Katsuhiro's hearing was muffled by the mask. The gas mask had an unpleasant rubbery smell. The odor of gas stuck to the back of his throat and irritated it, but he couldn't spit, and he swallowed his gathering phlegm down repeatedly until he felt nauseous. The cloud, now a rich mustard brown, closed in over the troops. At first, all he could hear was his breathing, in and out. Roar and hiss with the click of the mask's simple purifier. The gas thickened until Runnican was a grey shape, though he was only a couple of meters away. False calm descended, peaceful and poisonous. A man, blood running from blinded eyes and blistered lips, burst from the fog. Katsuhiro fired reflexively at him, missing in his fright. The man was clawing at his face, his screams turning to gurgles. His shoulder clipped Katsuhiro hard as he ran by, and the gas swallowed him again. Screaming came out of the fog. Not all of the troops had gas masks. Many that did couldn't work them, or had equipment that was damaged. They ran about in terror. One, with greater presence of mind, turned over bodies for a gas mask, finding one, slipping it on just in time. 2 men brawled over a mask. Neither had any hope of donning. Others tried to run, but fell, screaming froth from burning throats. Time slowed. Katsuhiro moved as a man underwater. Images of horror appeared as sheets of gas shifted like weeds in currents, each waft of poison opening a curtain on another scene of suffering. It seemed to go on forever, as awful things do, though according to Katsuhiro's chronometer, less than 2 minutes went by. The screams died, as men died. Vapor drank the sound of the wall guns, squeezing them down to subaquatic thumps. Laser flash dispersed by the gas turned the rolling clouds into alien thunderstorms of yellow and brown, lit by red lightning. A roaring scream sounded right over Katsuhiro. Glaring yellow appeared overhead, and a wash of heat blasted the poison fog aside. A huge metal ovoid bore right down on him. He was frozen, sure he would be crushed. Other men, revealed by the backwash of the descending pod, were close to breaking, but a giant in red stood among them, his bolter ready, shouting, "Stand firm, servants of terror!" Their panic quelled, they held. A storm of tracer bullets ripped around the vehicle, puncturing it many times. Half its thrusters went out, and it tilted over, hurtling off into the wastes beyond the third defense line. It was only the first. A drop pod assault was an intentionally terrifying spectacle. The pods fell so fast they seemed to be upon the verge of destruction, only firing their retro thrusters at the last minute to slow their descent from fatal velocity. They smashed into the ground with a force that would kill an unmodified human outright, even one lucky enough to wear power armor. The noise they made was tremendous, like containers full of scrap metal slammed into rock. Explosive bolts went off in crackling bursts, and the huge petal doors fell down with metallic booms. There were hundreds of them, suddenly, crowding the sky, jets roaring, some exploding. The fury of the wall guns was cutting over the third line, streaks of bullets and laslight almost close enough to touch, and all the roaring added to the havoc. More soft thumps overhead, more gas floated down. Different colors, copper oxide greens and heavy yellows, powder reds and blues. Electromag munitions blew, filling the fog with crackling energy that earthed on the ceramite of the Space Marines in crawling displays of lightning. "Stand firm!" roared the Space Marines, their deep voices pushed into inhumanity by the harshening of helmet voxes. "Stand firm!" they shouted, and no one dared run. Katsuhiro had only an impression of the warriors disembarking from their pods before the thickening gas hid them all. Again, so much transpired in so short a space of time, seconds maybe, but fearful years crawled by. He saw nothing in the murk, but the Space Marines' auto-senses penetrated it easily, and they called out once again, "They come! Ready weapons! For the Emperor!" The Space Marines brought up their bolters to their shoulders and opened fire. There were perhaps 24 Blood Angels on that section of the rampart. Nothing compared to the massed thousands who had fought on alien worlds the length and breadth of the galaxy. And yet the report of their bolters firing, even in such thin numbers, struck Katsuhiro with terror. They barked like hellhounds out of ancient myth, each round the equal of another age's cannon shot. Bastion 16's guns raked past the rampart's front. Katsuhiro saw large shapes collapse. The wall guns still fired over their heads at the drop pods. So much noise. The first of the enemy legionaries came out of the gas in a line, their own bolters firing. A human voice bellowed along the rampart, "Troopers of the Kushten Garda! Present arms!" 2 men down from Katsuhiro, a soldier was hit in the shoulder by a bolt round. When the mass reactive detonated, the man's torso from his right shoulder to his hip ceased to be. A mist of blood joined the fog. The end of his left arm was blown clear. The right arm and the head, connected by shredded bridges of tissue, collapsed inwards. "Ready!" the human officer bellowed. Katsuhiro rested his gun on the rampart's lip. Though the men were sheltered by the fortification, in most cases only their heads exposed, they were still being hit, still dying. The Blood Angels knelt, but they were so big their chests protruded over the defense line. Bolt rounds blew on their armor, taking out chunks of metalloceramic from the plates. The enemy were targeting them in favor of the lesser men. Incredibly, so it seemed to Katsuhiro, one of the Crimson Angels fell, his chest a bloody ruin. "Aim!" the officer roared. Katsuhiro did his best to ignore the carnage among his fellow defenders. He'd played his part in repelling 6 assaults upon the defense line. He'd been bombed. He was ill, hungry, cold, and exhausted. But he had not yet faced traitor legionaries. He struggled to draw a bead on the warriors coming to kill him. Just aiming at them seemed profane somehow, a final inversion of how things were meant to be. Then they came from the fog, and terror showed a new face. They wore green and white armor, adorned with images of death. Where the Blood Angels were crimson and glorious, these beings were debased, though they wore the same war gear and had been created the same way. Their battle plate was filthy and streaked with dirt and rust. From their vision and breathing slits, oily fluids dribbled. Black smoke poured from the exhaust vents on their power plants. They shuffled forwards without the Blood Angel's grace, while preceding them was a stench of sickness, the collective illness of a hospice ward in time of plague distilled. They were dead men walking, and yet they would not fall. Autocannon rounds, bolts, las cannon shots, and explosive shells fell among them. Armor shattered on their bodies, but if they dropped, They climbed back up. Katsuhiro saw one riddled with dozens of hits from the loyal Space Marines. Only when a bolt punched through his helm and detonated in his skull did the filthy giant collapse to his knees and pitch forwards into the mud. Katsuhiro drew a bead on a warrior advancing without his helmet. He was getting close. Close enough to see wild, lidless eyes in a face as drawn as a skull, and a black-lipped mouth forever set in death's humorless grin. "Fire!" the officer ordered. Katsuhiro squeezed the trigger. Hundreds of las beams flickered through the fog. His own shot scored clean black through the slime weeping from the monster's armor plates. But the guns of the mortals were of little use against legionary battleplate. Lucky shots to eyes and soft seal joints might do some harm, but such wounds were nothing to the corrupted legionaries. A battle cry went up behind the advancing traitors, and foes more suited to Katsuhiro's gun emerged. Through the gas, the lost and the damned charged the line again.